Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Way back when, I talked briefly about the fact that the APA had put out a set of guidelines for working with men and boys and focused primarily on general themes being discussed in the articles talking about them. I didn't actually do a deep dive into the guidelines themselves. I felt like that would be a topic for down the line, perhaps when I'd gotten some actual experience as a counselor working with men and boys. Well, now I do indeed have a little bit of experience in that realm. So perhaps it's best, if I want to continue working with this population, that I be aware of the current best practices to be able to most effectively support them, right? Let's go ahead and take a look. Even in the first paragraph of the introduction, there's a veritable boatload to talk about. Boys and men are diverse with respect to their race, ethnicity, culture, migration status, age, socioeconomic status, ability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religious affiliation. So basically, men are unique individuals. What a revelation. On this groundbreaking note, let's continue. Each of these social identities contributes uniquely and in intersecting ways to shape how men experience and perform their masculinities. I'm not even going to finish that sentence. I want to hone in on exactly this specific point: how men experience and perform their masculinities. If you want a quick and easy primer on how this sounds weird, tell me how you feel when you hear the phrase, how women perform their femininities. Because if that doesn't sound like a phrase that's about to precede some patronizing and possibly even misogynistic stereotypes, I don't know what does. The same applies to men. It's this unnatural and artificial way of referring to qualities of men as if there's some kind of script outside of them that they performatively enact. I'm having a difficult time trying to explain all the reasons I feel uncomfortable with it, but honestly, it just comes down to a sense of detachment in the language that is so far from what a real conversation with men would actually look like. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but hey, maybe when you're claiming to be the definitive guidelines for working with a specific subset of humans, nitpicking may be warranted. Although boys and men, as a group, tend to hold privilege and power based on gender, they also demonstrate disproportionate rates of receiving harsh discipline, suspension and expulsion, academic challenges, dropping out of high school, particularly among African American and Latino boys, mental health issues, completed suicide, physical health problems, cardiovascular problems, public health concerns, violence, substance abuse, incarceration, and early mortality, and a wide variety of other quality of life issues, relational problems, family well-being. So, it's just humorous in general to format a sentence like, "This group has a lot of privilege and power, but here is a comprehensive list of all the ways that things are tough for them." Just a teensy bit tone deaf. And B, speaking of tone deaf, it's really not a great look to start off your guidelines for working with a specific population by effectively qualifying their suffering by first telling them that, as a group, they are privileged. Just want to go ahead and start that relationship with wedges and assumptions right from the get-go, eh? This is going to be a bumpy ride. I'm going to skip ahead a bit to a few of the definitions. Gender bias. The term gender bias refers to beliefs and attitudes that involve stereotypes or preconceived ideas about the roles, abilities, and characteristics of males and females that may contain significant distortions and inaccuracies. Psychologists have an ethical obligation to recognize and confront these biases. Masculinity ideology. Masculinity ideology is a set of descriptive, prescriptive, and proscriptive of cognitions about boys and men. Although there are differences in masculinity ideologies, there is a particular constellation of standards that have held sway over large segments of the population, including anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness, and adventure, risk, and violence. These have been collectively referred to as traditional masculinity ideology. Additionally, acknowledging the plurality of and social constructionist perspective of masculinity, the term masculinities is being used with increasing frequency. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm just quibbling here, but this is an extremely restrictive and overly negative view of what constitutes masculinity as a concept. Of the mere 6 objects they use to describe what is a very complicated subject, 2 of them are actually focused on what masculinity is not, including anti-femininity, which they use as their opener, by the way, and otherwise they are largely coded in language that comes across as rather negative. For example, pairing risk closely together with violence creates a certain kind of negative imagery, like a criminal mastermind or juvenile delinquent drinking and driving, whereas in reality, many men may be more likely to take risks, say, in coming to aid those in need or in the business world. Another example is in using the term eschewal of the appearance of weakness, rather than something like focus on personal strength. And just to highlight again that anti-femininity is placed at the top of the list speaks to what I would almost call a level of defensiveness, focusing on the fact that in the author's view of masculinity, the primary goal is to be against looking feminine. As if that is really even a fully accurate picture of what many men actually feel it means to be a man. Again, it just feels wildly out of touch. Also, just don't even get me started on the idea of social constructivism. I may be against the idea of condensing masculinity into a paltry handful of oversimplified terms, but I'm also against the idea of pulling out the handy-dandy label machine and applying masculinity to whatever anyone wants. It's okay to acknowledge that a subject can be at once both complex and yet still have reasonably defined boundaries, guys, I promise. There's some other stuff I could focus on in here, but I don't want to drag this out unnecessarily. Next section. Need for professional practice guidelines for boys and men. Boys and men have historically been the focus of psychological research and practice as a normative referent for behavior rather than as gendered human beings. Okay, for real. For something that claims to be about working with men and boys, they sure are spending a lot of time qualifying their statements with a lot of talk about how men have supposedly been sitting pretty high on the hog in a lot of ways. Also, as a mildly interesting note, this is essentially the same subject I wrote a paper on in my first encounter with feminism video, the idea that men have long been considered as default. In that paper, I argued on the level of, if there's only 2 categories, one is necessarily going to come before the other, and it doesn't mean that they're any more important, just different. Which is a fine place to start, but we can go even deeper with it. I will grant you that in the past some assumptions about women's health have been made based on studies that focused on male subjects, but that's an interesting point to consider in another light. More than men being considered the default in research, men have more often been considered the disposable sex, on which it has historically been permissible to perform many more experiments and tests of things like new drugs, as opposed to what would ever have been considered tolerable for women and girls. So, while not to minimize the fact that there have certainly been some examples of crude and sexist underpinnings in some psychological research of old, it's hardly accurate to act like the field has been solely based on some he-man woman haters club either. For instance, socialization for conforming to traditional masculinity ideology has been shown to limit males' psychological development, constrain their behavior, result in gender role strain and gender role conflict, and negatively influence mental health and physical health. Indeed, boys and men are overrepresented in a variety of psychological and social problems. For example, boys are disproportionately represented among school children with learning difficulties, lower standardized test scores, and behavior problems, bullying, school suspensions, aggression. Likewise, men are overrepresented in prisons and are more likely than women to commit violent crimes, and are at greatest risk of being a victim of violent crime. Homicide, aggravated assault. This whole section is reaching so hard that it's going to need physio. I really wonder the extent to which many boys are actually being raised in the caricature of masculinity they reference. I mean, I'm sure if we all rack our brains, we can think of stereotypical men figures like the ones they're talking about. Beefy, hyper-masculine sports buffs, doofy suburban barbecue dads like the ones they show in commercials, cold and domineering businessmen, emotionally distant, abusive redneck types wearing wife beaters, raising sons to be a chip off the old block and allow for aggressive, uncaring behavior where they just say, boys will be boys, because anything is better than to be a sissy. But how often is this actually happening? Because there is a preponderance of evidence showing that father involvement leads to positive outcomes in their children's lives. Better cognitive development, better social development, positive emotional outcomes such as reduced anxiety and increased stress tolerance, and decreased risk of behavior problems and delinquency. You know, the direct opposite of a lot of the problems they were referencing in that paragraph above. Meanwhile, the outcomes for single mother households looks a lot more similar to the kind of statistics they're citing. And yes, I'll include some references in the low bar. You would think that if masculinity was such a toxic influence, that children would do better with less of it in their lives, but the evidence just doesn't support it. It also doesn't help that they fail to factor in other explanations for some of the phenomena they list, like the sentencing gap or biases towards girls in the school system. No, we're going to hitch all of men's problems to this one very narrow-minded view we have of masculinity. What could possibly go wrong? Research suggests that socialization practices that teach boys from an early age to be self-reliant, strong, and to minimize and manage their problems on their own yield adult men who are less willing to seek mental health treatment. Further complicating their ability to receive help, many men report experiencing gender bias in therapy, which may impact diagnosis and treatment. For instance, several studies have identified that men, despite being 4 times more likely than women to die of suicide worldwide, are less likely to be diagnosed with internalizing disorders such as depression, in part because internalizing disorders do not conform to traditional gender role stereotypes about men's emotionality. Instead, because of socialized tendencies to externalize emotional distress, boys and men may be more likely to be diagnosed with externalizing disorders, conduct disorder, and substance use disorders. Okay, is it just me, or is this whole thing feeling very unfocused here? It really seems to bounce back and forth between blaming men for their own problems, coming close to understanding something that might be relevant, and then just going back to making it about men. If you want to talk honestly about the bias in mental health fields against men's needs, you have to stop bringing the conversation back to men's socialization being the problem. As effective mental health professionals who purport to be in the field to help people, it's on us to recognize the different ways that mental health concerns may present in different clients. It's not men's fault that psychology programs consist of 80% women, and that many training courses are now focused on social justice themes rather than actual relevant clinical training. Funny enough, as a counselor working exclusively with male clients at this time, I'm finding that when you present men with an actual, legitimate, non-judgmental place that takes their concerns seriously, weirdly enough, they have no problem opening up and sharing about some of the things going on for them. Isn't that just the darndest thing? In addition to specific mental health concerns and help-seeking behaviors, a combination of biological, social, and economic factors may have unique consequences for men's physical health and well-being. For most leading causes of death in the United States and in every age group, boys and men have higher death rates than girls and women. For example, despite men having greater socioeconomic advantages than women in every ethnic group, the age-adjusted death rate has been found to be at least 40% higher for men than women. What? What was that weird little bit thrown in there? How is that even relevant? You see what I mean? I'm not just imagining this. They really are taking every opportunity to sneak in little quips throughout this thing about how men are supposedly advantaged over women, even when the claim is completely irrelevant to the topic being discussed. We're talking about death rates, guys. Where in the hell do you pull socioeconomics from in this? It absolutely is nothing but bad faith whataboutism all the way down, isn't it? In summary, contemporary studies indicate that the physical and mental health concerns of boys and men are associated with complex and diverse economic, biological, developmental, psychological, and sociocultural factors. Many of these factors also intersect with men's multiple identities, indicating that understanding how boys and men experience masculinity is an important cultural competency. The psychology of men, however, is rarely taught at either undergraduate or graduate levels, including multicultural counseling courses. Research further suggests that having adequate knowledge of men's gender role socialization has important implications for psychological practice with boys. Well, as you've clearly demonstrated so far, I'm sure that we're going to have a very adequate educational experience going forward, aren't we? God, I set out to write about the APA guidelines for men and boys, and I spent all this time just venting about the introduction. This is going to be a hell of a project. I don't think that I'll necessarily dedicate all of my next several videos to going through them. There's a lot to cover, and until I really start reading into it, there's no way of knowing just how much I'll be able to skim and how much I'll need to sit down and pick apart. So, like with many of my other video projects, I reserve the right to pause and take breaks to cover other subjects, and to preserve my sanity. But I feel like it's important to break this down, not just to make it accessible for the layman to know what they're promoting in the field these days, but so that actually responsible psychologists who legitimately have an interest in ensuring the best care for men and boys can know what to be on the lookout for. So all this being said, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.